Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the new Tamron 25-200mm. This is an F2.8 to 5.6 DI3, which means it's designed for mirrorless. VXD, which is the voice coil autofocus motor that's in it, and this is a G2 or a second generation lens. That's a lot of different initials in the name there, but what we have here is an evolution of Tamron's very popular 28-200mm RXD lens that was released back in 2020. I have found that lens to be a very valuable one, and so I was intrigued when Tamron announced not only a G2 version, but also that they have increased the zoom range to what is now an 8x zoom ratio. Now, of course, that doesn't quite match Sigma's 20-200mm contemporary lens that was released about a month and a half ago. However, that lens did have some severe compromises to reach 20mm, and so I was very intrigued to see if Tamron was able to mitigate some of those compromises to produce a lens that had some improvements relative to their first generation lens, while also pushing the boundary on the wide end a little bit, as they have done here. And so in today's review, we're going to explore whether or not Tamron has been successful in pulling that off, and whether or not this new 25-200mm VXD is the lens in the class to buy now. I'm going to be filming all of these outdoor segments on the lens itself to give you a sense of how it renders, how it tracks me in these situations. And so we'll dive in and take a look. I do want to say thank you to Tamron for sending me a loaner of this lens. As always, however, they have had no input in my review, and in fact, they will not see it before you do. This is completely independent. My findings are my own.
Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off.
All right, let's jump in and take a look at some of the build and design features here. And so obviously we do have a wider focal length, which now scales us up to an 8x zoom range because we are going all the way to the 25mm. And so you can see how that compares relative to the 28-200mm. If I put them both on a tripod and I compare, it's a very noticeable difference between the amount of extra framing that you can get at 25mm. Now, to give you, while I don't have the Sigma side by side here, I did do a similar comparison with the Sigma 20-200mm and the Tamron. You can see it's an even more radical difference. 20mm is considerably wider than what 25mm is. However, as I pointed out in that Sigma review, there was a pretty severe penalty that came, compromises that had to be made to get all the way to 20mm. You can see I'm putting it up here. I've got a chart that I've made up that takes a look at the light gathering potential of all three of these lenses. And I will say the best remains the 28-200mm. Tamron was a little bit more conservative in their design at that point, but the trade-off is that this lens is remarkable at how long it holds the various apertures, and it's not until you hit 147mm that you actually achieve the smallest maximum aperture of the 28-200mm. Things aren't nearly as rosy on the 25-200mm, where you hit f5.6 at 96mm instead. So you've got pretty much 50mm less before you're hitting that smallest maximum aperture. The Sigma, however, of course, is far worse. And the Sigma actually hits f5.6 at 51mm, and then by 85mm, it's at f6.3, which is a smaller maximum aperture than what either of these lenses reaches at all. And there is, of course, no f2.8 at all. And so as you look at that chart, you can see that the Sigma is just an incredibly dark lens in terms of light gathering potential, particularly relative to the 28-200, but even relative to the 25-200mm lens. And so I was afraid that this would happen with the Tamron when it moved to 25mm. And while it is somewhat disappointing, Frank, at least it's not nearly as bad as what we saw on the Sigma. So that is going to be your primary negative trade-off if you're looking at upgrading from this lens to the new Tamron, is you do lose some light gathering potential. However, you do gain in pretty much every other area. Now, none of these lenses have lens-based stabilization, and so you're going to have to rely on in-camera corrections, stabilization if your camera is so equipped, but there really isn't an option that's going to give you that stabilization at the moment. We have an expanded feature set here with the new G2 lens, and so the one feature that was shared is that both lenses had a zoom lock on the side, and that only locks at the wide end. But what we do have the addition of is that we have a custom/function button, and we have a USB-C port. It's weather sealed on the outside. Now, there's a little bit more than what meets the eye. A lot of times you see that and you think, well, that's just for firmware updates. In this case, you actually have access to Tamron's lens utility software, and it allows you to do quite a lot with this and then the button itself. You can set that button to a variety of different functions than what you can within camera, and the thing is you can assign a lens specific. So for example, there's no AF/MF switch here, but you can make the function button an AF/MF switch if you want something like that. What's more, you have the ability to control the behavior of the focus ring in a variety of ways, whether it's going to be linear, non-linear, how far the focus throw is. So you do have some customization that you can do to this lens that you can't do to any of the other lenses. So that is appreciated. Now, the lens has grown very slightly relative to the 28-200, but not much, as you can see here. The new lens is 76.2mm in diameter, and so slimmer than what the Sigma lens is. That's 3 inches in diameter, and it's 121.5mm or 4.8 inches in length, and so that is a little bit longer than the Sigma, which is 115 and change millimeters. However, the Sigma inner barrel does extend further. This extends out 70mm, whereas the Sigma extends out 75mm. And so when they're extended, it is the shorter of the two lenses, but just be aware that it is a little bit longer. It is the longest of these three by a small margin there. It weighs in at 573 grams or 1.3 pounds. And so again, a moderate, very manageable weight. Tamron has been very, very intentional about retaining a 6-7mm front filter thread on all lenses possible. And that is the vast, vast majority of the lenses they've produced for mirrorless at this point. And so the fact that you can share filters with a wide variety of other Tamron lenses is certainly an advantage. The Sigma has a 72mm filter thread, which obviously is going to be shared with fewer lenses. This lens also has a really thorough degree of weather sealing for this type of lens. There's 12 different seal points, as you can see in this diagram. So that's 5 more seal points than what you're going to find on the Sigma. And so it's just a little bit more robust of a weather sealing there. Inside we have 9 rounded aperture blades, no aperture ring here. However, you are going to find that the zoom ring, the 2 rings that are here, the zoom ring actually works a lot smoother, at least on the copies that I tested. I found that the Sigma zoom ring was kind of tight and it didn't move with consistent pressure. And so there was just sticky points, whereas this moves in a much smoother fashion. The manual focus ring, it does move smoothly. However, it doesn't have a lot of weight to it. So I don't find it to be the best manual focus simulation, but it's pretty comparable to everything else that I've seen on this class. Now, the new lens design, it feels more upscale than the Generation 1 lens, which is a pretty bland looking lens. This one is a little bit glossier. It's got some sculpts to it. The actual rings, they stick out a little bit more. They're more deeply ribbed. The whole thing just feels more premium, which is obviously the point. Now, interestingly here, the included lens hood is just a little bit more shallow, as you can see, than what was on the original lens. For whatever reason, they've determined that it doesn't need to be quite as deep there. Unfortunately, as we're going to see later on, flare resistance is great. Now, it has become a trend with a lot of zoom lenses, but certainly with these type lenses, that there's a variable minimum focus distance. Now, both the Tamron and the Sigma claim a maximum magnification of 0.50 times. The Sigma's magnification can be accessed anywhere between 28 and 85 millimeters. So it's actually quite versatile and easy to get that magnification. Not so with the Tamron. The Tamron here has a minimum focus distance on the wide end of 16 centimeters. One problem, when I measured from the sensor to the end of the lens with the lens hood off, it was 14 centimeters, which means there's no way for even the lens hood to fit there. And as you can see here, I'm basically right on top of my test chart to test for that, making it almost impossible to get proper light in there, and the end result is garbage, frankly. Whereas with the Sigma, I had a lot more versatility in getting that. I found that with the Tamron that somewhere between 45 and 50 millimeters was a better way to work with. I didn't get quite as high of magnification, but I got a nice even performance, a nice flat plane of focus, and so that's far more usable. And so yes, it can achieve a maximum magnification of 0.50 times, but that is basically just marketing. There's not really a lot of practical ways to achieve that. So that's one area where I do like the Sigma better. Price here is $899 US, so that makes it 100 more than the 28-200, but 100 less than the Sigma 20-200 millimeter. Feels like pretty fair value for what you're getting here. Overall, it's a nice package, not a perfect package, but well executed and does a lot of things really quite well. So let's talk autofocus. One of the key upgrades here is we have moved from the RXD, which is a stepping motor from the first generation, to a VXD, which is a voice coil style motor in this new generation of lens. VXD stands for Voice Coil Extreme Torque Drive. And what you've got is a more sophisticated autofocus motor that is smoother, it's quieter, and also faster in operation. Where that's particularly needed is on the telephoto end. With lenses like this, it needs far less thrust on the wide end than what it does on the telephoto end, and getting a higher powered motor like this does enable it to have a more equal performance throughout the zoom range. What I found in my formal test is that it's essentially instant on the wide end, but as you go towards the telephoto end in indoor conditions, I found autofocus did slow a little bit. You can see that. Outdoors, it sped back up, and it's pretty close to instantaneous back and forth. A lens like this with variable aperture, it's going to prefer better light for obvious reasons. It's only f5.6 on the telephoto end. I was really pleasantly surprised, however, to see that when I went out, I could not only easily acquire birds in flight, but I could track them very successfully. In fact, one of these burst, it was 105 frames in the shot, and it seemed like basically every frame was perfectly focused along the way. Now, some people will mistake a lens like this because it goes to 200 millimeters that it's a dedicated telephoto lens. It's not really. This is a do-it-all type lens, and so it's not going to be as good as, for example, their 70 to 180 millimeter F2.8 VXD lens. That is a constant F2.8 maximum aperture. And of course, it has a more constrained zoom range, and so it's going to do better when it comes to actual sports or wildlife type conditions. But if you're in decent lighting conditions, this lens has enough thrust to get the job done, and I think that most people are going to be pretty pleasantly surprised with what you get. In all of the different situations that I used this lens, I found that autofocus was perfectly sufficient to the task. I have zero reservations about it. Great job on this Tamron. This is a nice area of improvement. So how about autofocus for video work? Once again, the VXD motor proves its worth here because you can see in doing focus pulls that they are nicely damped, they're quick, they're confident, no visible steps along the way. Another thing that really stands out to me is how low the focus breathing is. And that allows you to really achieve nice results because there's not some obvious difference between close and focus subjects in terms of their size on frame. And so it just allows those focus transitions to be smoother and more cinematic. When I did my hand test, I felt like it went reasonably well, though focus did on some occasions want to just kind of predictably stay locked on my face and not be distracted by my hand. It's more of a camera related thing than a lens related thing necessarily. What I also found is that when I approached the camera that I had no problems with the lens quickly reacquiring if I ducked or stepped out of frame. And so you can see that it's doing a great job on that front as well. One other area that I will point out before I move on from this subject is that I did prefer this lens relative to the Sigma 20-200 when it came to the zoom action. I found that the zoom action was a little bit tight on the Sigma and I wasn't able to get smooth zooms while videoing. I also felt like the Tamron was maybe a little bit better. It's not like a parfocal lens, but it felt like there wasn't any kind of focus readjusting that was necessarily taking place along the way. And so I was able to zoom in and out in a variety of situations, and I didn't really notice like a lag with autofocus where kind of arriving there and then focus arrives just a little bit later. And so in general, I would say that I was pleased with autofocus, and as you've seen in these outdoor settings, lighting is really kind of harsh today, but at the same time, you can see it's having no problem in tracking me and staying focused on me in these various settings. All right, let's talk image quality. Optical design is 18 elements in 14 groups, which, by the way, that's the exact same number of elements and groups that we find on the Sigma, but obviously a very different optical design here. This design includes some GM or glass molded aspherical elements, LD, low dispersion, and XLD or extra low dispersion elements as a part of it. We can see, looking at the MTF charts, that on both the wide and on the telephoto end, it's really strong for this type of lens, carrying on the tradition that we saw with the 28-200mm. There is some astigmatism. In this case, it's the sagittal axis that is really strong at both 25 and 200 millimeters, and the meridional axis is just a little bit weaker, trails off a little bit more. But what we see when I compare to the Sigma is that you can see that at both the wide and the telephoto end, the MTFs favor the Tamron lens. In my real-world test on my test chart, I found that the Tamron was definitely sharper at the wide end, not by a huge margin, but particularly in the corners, it is sharper there. And then on the telephoto end, it's a little bit of give and take. The Tamron is ever so slightly sharper, but not really in a meaningful kind of way. Likewise, I found about the same thing with the 28-200mm, that at 28 versus 25 millimeters, the 25 millimeter on the new lens is sharper on the wide end. On the telephoto end, pretty much a wash there. Now, one area where the Tamron still has a serious advantage over the Sigma is that the Sigma exhibits on the wide end a pretty terrible amount of complex distortion. And so I needed a +39 to try to correct for it. But you can see that even after correction, it's a mess. It's just a very complex distortion pattern. The Tamron has far less distortion. I only needed a +19 to correct, but it's also a very linear correction. And so it just corrects in a much cleaner fashion, and so it means even with the profile corrections, it's going to look cleaner, even with that attached to it. It still has a lot of vignette on the wide end. I needed a +96 to correct, but I was able to perfectly correct at 96, whereas with the Sigma, I maxed out the slider at 100, and I still could have gone further because there was still more vignette to correct. And so definitely an advantage there. As you begin to zoom in, you'll find that the barrel distortion inverts to a pincushion distortion. It stays throughout a lot of the range in the place where I tested at about a -7, a mild amount to correct. It corrects in a nice linear fashion, no problem there, and vignette drops way down. I only needed a +42 to correct, either at 100 millimeter or 200 millimeters, so good there. When I tested for fringing, I got really well-controlled fringing results both on my test chart and out in real-world situations. No issues there. I also saw no lateral style chromatic aberrations. When I tested for sharpness, I found that I got an excellent center, really sharp for this kind of lens on the wide end. I got a very strong mid-frame, and I got good corners. And what's more, one of my chief complaints about the Sigma is that even as I stopped the lens down, the corners never really sharpened up much, and so I never could get great landscape results because the corners never really got sharp. That's not true here with the Tamron. You can see that it holds an advantage relative to the Sigma, both of them at f8. And what's more, in real world results, I liked the corner performance a lot better. Better detail, better contrast there in those corners. Now you're going to hit diffraction starting at f11. This is a variable aperture lens, and so that means also the minimum aperture is variable. On the wide end, it's only f16. By the time you get to the telephoto end, it's f32. So particularly on the telephoto end, when you get all the way to f32, there's a vast difference between f11 and f32. And so I typically say in most situations, f11 is kind of my upper limit that I personally use for photography, because you pay a price, particularly on high resolution bodies like I'm using after f11 when it comes to diffraction. Moving on through the zoom range, 50 millimeters is awesome. It looks great all across the frame, very strong results, very great contrast. That's probably the area where this lens has the biggest advantage over the Sigma. The Sigma was not great at 50 millimeters. This lens is fantastic at 50 millimeters. And so really, really good results there. By the time I get to 100 millimeters, I'm less impressed. It's a little less contrasty. It doesn't sharpen up as much. And then at 200 millimeters, it's slightly better than what it is at 100 millimeters. Kind of the same pattern as what I saw on the Sigma. They obviously engineered for the, the telephoto end, and that beginning of the telephoto range gets a little less love in the optical design. But in this case, I found real world 200 millimeter results. Actually, that's where I saw a bigger difference relative to the Sigma. My real world results were pretty punchy, really, all things considered, and not as sharp in the corners, but in the rule of thirds zone, the middle 2/3 looks really, really fantastic there. What's more, I found that the bokeh quality was better relative to the Sigma. In most situations, these are variable, they're all-in-one zoom with a variable aperture. They're not going to replace a nice prime for the overall rendering, but I did find that I got plenty of shots where I felt like the bokeh looked good. And if I'm looking at bright specular highlights, yes, there is a little bit of busyness inside of them, but there's not the really hard outlining that I saw with the Sigma. And so it's a nicer result, and I felt like real-world results were nicer generally. There's some occasions where you can get busier results because it's a smaller maximum aperture, but in general, they looked pretty good, and so I'm not concerned about that. Colors look excellent. Tamron has good optical glass, as does Sigma and these major lens brands, so all of that looks fine, no problems there. Flare resistance is really strong. Impressively strong, actually. Tamron's B-Bar 2 coatings seem to be doing a great job. The lens is very flare resistant, particularly on the wide end where it matters the most. And so in general, I was pleased with what I saw on that. Optically, my biggest negatives is the fact that we've lost some light gathering potential relative to the older lens, but outside of that, it's basically better in almost every metric. And so great job, Tamron, there. So my conclusion is that I think that Tamron has done a good job of mitigating some of the compromises that come with building a lens like this. The thing that really endeared the 28-200mm to me back in 2020, I actually ended up subsequently buying one, and I've used it extensively while traveling over the last 5 years. But what endeared it to me is the fact that it was surprisingly strong optically for a lens like that. Typically, well, always, you're going to be having to endure some compromises to get that broad zoom range, because it means that the engineers, they can't really design for a wide angle or a telephoto or a standard lens. They've got to engineer for all of those things. So there are corners that are going to be cut. And while I love the fact on paper that the Sigma goes all the way to 20 millimeters and all the extra composition options that brings, there is a lot of compromises that went into that lens. And so the more that I used it, the less enthusiastic I became about it for that reason. Now I recognize your mileage may vary, and maybe some of the priorities for me are not necessarily priorities for you. And if you have bought that lens or are planning to buy that lens, absolutely go for it and enjoy it. To me, this Tamron lens, while it isn't nearly as dramatically wide, it also preserves some of the integrity of what I loved about the 28-200mm. Namely, that this is still a very, very good lens optically. I felt like not only was the sharpness better on the 25-200, but also the bokeh and the general rendering is nicer. There's less compromises when it comes to distortion and even vignette to some degree. And so all of those things add up to a lens that to me is a little bit more usable. Now, my conclusion for those of you that already own the 28-200mm, if you're looking for just pure optical improvements, I'm not sure that it's worth buying the 25-200mm. It is very slightly better in some situations, but as we've seen, it also comes with the loss of some light gathering due to just expanding the formula from 28 to 25 millimeters. At the same time, if you're more interested in getting that wider zoom range, getting better autofocus, getting some more features. I certainly think that there are compelling reasons to upgrade. I just don't think that they solely include an optical performance. If you are new in the market and you're looking for an all-in-one / travel type zoom, this is my pick at this point. I feel like the 25-200mm, it just does a lot of things right. It gives you so much versatility, and while you can't really access that 0.50 times magnification as well as you can on the Sigma, it still has a high degree of magnification, and you can do a lot with this lens. It really does provide a lot of versatility. It's got good weather sealing, great autofocus, and so if you're thinking about a lens and you just want to travel with one lens, this lens is pretty sweet for everything that it does, and doing it in a pretty compelling package. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.